father was killed there on the ground. The child's hand was amputated to save his life.
Legiun asing Ukraina bergabung dalam pertempuran melawan Rusia. Pemerintah Ukraina telah meminta sukarelawan untuk bergabung dengan tentaranya. Apakah mereka akan membuat perbedaan? Pada tanggal 26 Februari, hanya 2 hari setelah Rusia menginvasi Ukraina, Presiden Ukraina Volodymyr Zelensky menyerukan sukarelawan asing untuk bergabung dengan Angkatan Bersenjata Ukraina, mengumumkan pembentukan Legiun Internasional. 2 hari kemudian, Presiden menandatangani dekret penghapusan visa bagi warga negara asing yang ingin bergabung dengan tentara Ukraina, sementara Kementerian Luar Negeri meluncurkan situs web yang memberikan rincian tentang cara mendaftar. Beberapa pejabat Eropa menyambut baik seruan tersebut dan mendorong warganya untuk menjadi sukarelawan. Setidaknya 2 pejabat anggota parlemen Latvia, Juris Juras dan mantan Menteri Pertahanan Georgia Irakli Okrasashvili, telah memberikan contoh, secara pribadi melakukan perjalanan ke Ukraina untuk bergabung dalam upaya perang. Beberapa pejabat Eropa menyambut baik seruan tersebut dan mendorong warganya untuk menjadi sukarelawan. Setidaknya 2 pejabat anggota parlemen Latvia, Juris Juras dan mantan Menteri Pertahanan Georgia Irakli Okrasashvili, telah memberikan contoh, secara pribadi melakukan perjalanan ke Ukraina untuk bergabung dalam upaya perang. Dalam beberapa hari terakhir, pihak berwenang Ukraina mengatakan bahwa sekitar 20.000 orang dari 52 negara telah mendaftar untuk bergabung dengan legiun tersebut. Pada tanggal 26 Februari, hanya 2 hari setelah Rusia menginvasi Ukraina, Presiden Ukraina Volodymyr Zelensky menyerukan sukarelawan asing untuk bergabung dengan Angkatan Bersenjata Ukraina, mengumumkan pembentukan Legiun Internasional. 2 hari kemudian, Presiden menandatangani dekret yang membebaskan visa bagi setiap warga negara asing yang ingin bergabung dengan tentara Ukraina, sementara Kementerian Luar Negeri meluncurkan situs web yang memberikan perincian tentang cara mendaftar. Para ahli yang berbicara dengan Al Jazeera mengatakan bahwa masih belum ada bukti pergerakan besar-besaran sukarelawan sayap kanan menuju Ukraina. Soal legalitas, meskipun pejabat dari Kanada, Inggris, Republik Ceko, Denmark, Latvia, dan negara-negara lain telah secara terbuka atau diam-diam mendorong warganya untuk bergabung dengan tentara Ukraina dalam perangnya melawan Rusia, ada juga pertanyaan tentang legalitas tindakan semacam itu. Negara-negara seperti Inggris dan Kanada memiliki undang-undang yang melarang warganya berpartisipasi dalam aksi militer melawan negara yang tidak mereka perangi. Republik Ceko juga telah mengesahkan undang-undang yang membuat bergabung dengan angkatan bersenjata negara lain menjadi ilegal. Negara-negara lain, seperti Jerman, telah memperingatkan bahwa jika ada warga negaranya yang bergabung dalam upaya perang di Ukraina melanggar hukum internasional, mereka akan diadili. Di masa lalu, beberapa negara Eropa telah mengadili beberapa warga negara mereka yang telah berjuang di kedua sisi konflik 8 tahun di Donbas. Ukraina bukanlah negara Eropa pertama yang merekrut orang asing menjadi tentaranya. Prancis, misalnya, telah memiliki legiun khusus untuk warga negara asing sejak abad ke-19, sementara Inggris mengizinkan orang-orang dari persemakmuran bangsa-bangsa, yang terdiri dari bekas koloni Inggris untuk bertugas di angkatan bersenjatanya. Pihak berwenang Ukraina bersikeras bahwa pelamar harus melalui prosedur pemeriksaan, yang mencakup bukti catatan kriminal yang bersih. Namun, ada laporan bahwa lusinan orang asing telah menyeberang ke Ukraina tanpa mengikuti prosedur resmi. Sementara beberapa telah bergabung dengan tentara Ukraina, kami juga mengamati batalion yang terorganisir sendiri yang beroperasi secara terpisah dan tidak berpartisipasi dalam aksi militer terkoordinasi, sehingga banyak pejuang asing tidak diberi tugas oleh komandan di lapangan. Asya Metodieva, seorang peneliti di Institut Hubungan Internasional di Praha, kepada Al Jazeera. Menurut Metodieva, apakah pejuang asing diadili di negara asal mereka ketika mereka kembali dari Ukraina akan menjadi keputusan politik. Saya berharap pejuang asing yang mendukung perjuangan Ukraina tidak akan diperlakukan seperti pemerintah telah berurusan dengan pejuang yang bergabung dengan ISIS, katanya. Perdana Menteri Ceko Petr Fiala telah mengumumkan bahwa warga negara Ceko yang pergi berperang di Ukraina tidak akan menghadapi konsekuensi hukum setelah mereka kembali.
Just being fought by the armies of the two countries. Tens of thousands of foreigners are joining both sides. Will they face consequences under international law? And how will they affect the conflict? This is Inside. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Russia and Ukraine have mobilized hundreds of thousands of soldiers to fight the war. And both countries have made calls for foreigners to join their side. Volunteers are already making their way to the front lines. An Al Jazeera correspondent met these men from Sweden and Switzerland on the train from Poland to Ukraine. One said he faces 3 years in jail when he returns home, but insisted the sacrifice is worth it. Ukraine says up to 20,000 volunteers from 52 countries have signed up to join an international legion.
If this person fits requirement, we give the person contact in Ukraine, and person goes to Ukraine and then signs a contract with armed forces of Ukraine. So there is not mercenaries who are coming to earn money, not at all. This is people of goodwill who are coming to assist Ukraine to fight for freedom.
On the Russian side, President Vladimir Putin has approved allowing foreign fighters. The defense minister says 16,000 volunteers from the Middle East are ready to join. The U.S. believes Moscow is recruiting in Syria, where Russia has been helping government forces since 2015. But the Kremlin says those from the West who fight on Ukraine's side will be considered mercenaries with no protection under the Geneva Convention.
As to recruiting mercenaries all over the world and sending them to Ukraine, we can see that they, the Western sponsors of Ukraine, they're not hiding it, they're doing it openly, neglecting every norm of international law. Therefore, if you see that there are people willing to go there and help the people of Donbass as volunteers, especially free of charge, well, we should grant their wish and help them reach the combat zone.
Who came up with the idea of throwing mercenaries against our people, thugs from Syria, from the country that was destroyed in the same way as the invaders are destroying us now?
All right, let's take a look at the role of foreign fighters in conflicts. The war in Syria had one of the largest mobilization of foreigners. Thousands of them came from Western Europe to fight. After the rise of ISIL in 2014, the UN Security Council adopted resolutions to prevent the recruitment and travel of foreign fighters. Volunteers for Ukraine have been signing up at a faster rate than even in 2014 in Syria and Iraq. Some countries, like Belgium, have tried to discourage their citizens from going, while others, like Latvia, have approved a bill for people to take up arms for Ukraine. All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests in Moscow. Pavel Felgenhauer, defense and military analyst. In Providence, Rhode Island, in the U.S., Anthony Dworkin, senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And in Doha, Omar Ashur, founding chair of the Doha Institute's Critical Security Studies Program. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Omar, let me start with you today. All these foreign fighters that are joining the conflict in Ukraine, on both sides, what kind of an impact is that going to have?
Well, historically, we know that it has an impact, some benefits and maybe a lot of costs. So on the benefit side, they, depending on the type, they have a military impact. From a word from the Spanish Civil War, when you have the international brigade, was quantity means quality. Because of their numbers, the sheer numbers, even though poor training and less expertise, they managed to stop the Franco's army from taking Madrid. And Madrid didn't really fall except after the collapse of the war, after the collapse of the Republic and the end of the war. So there's some military benefits. They increase the manpower of whichever side they go to. They help with logistics and supplies. Some may bring military expertise, depending if they were regulars or irregulars. So they fought before in, let's say, an insurgency or an irregular warfare situation, or if they have formal military training, meaning that they were part of an official armed institute. And also they help with the morale boost, unit cohesion, especially the ideologues, the hardcores. They help a lot with the unit cohesion, we know that. And sometimes also they give international legitimacy, good with further recruitment of other foreign volunteers. And it depends on the narrative that is upheld. They help with further, let's say, internationalization of the cause, giving further legitimacy of the cause. That's on one side. But the costs, of course, we know that any mobilization and any demobilization has a lot of costs. Also, always the opposing side uses or abuses. So let's say if there are volunteers, actual volunteers who are committed to the cause of defending Ukraine, let's say, the other side, Russia in this case, will be saying that these are not volunteers, these are mercenaries. And if they are coming there to defend the democracy, they will be accused of being extremists and so on. And the other way around, of course, the other side has... also, I'm not saying that there are no ideologues, there are no people with like some, let's say, extremist ideologies involved, but they are very, very different types of reasons people volunteer. There are also mercenaries, meaning that they're actually paid to fight. So those also exist, but somehow volunteer and mercenary, they get brushed sometimes with the same brush.
Omar, let me get back to you on that point about mercenaries in just a couple of minutes. Pavel, let me go to you. How important is it for President Putin at this particular time, whether symbolically or logistically, how important is it for him to have foreign fighters involved?
Well, first of all, we should understand that there are no foreign fighters there, in fact, on the front line, none on the Russian side, and a very, very small number on the Ukrainian side. So we're talking about a future kind of situation more than one that's already there. President Putin, the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu publicly told the president that there are lots of volunteers in Syria with combat experience, apparently, who want to join the fight in the Donbass, and the president okayed that, but they don't understand they didn't come there yet. It's important for Russia, of course. It's important symbolically that the Russian cause is good a cause and it's going to be joined by foreigners. And secondary, the Russians actually have a very serious manpower issue with their military effort in Ukraine. The regular Russian army is more or less all in. Not all, of course, it has, but it can't move all its troops. I mean, not from the Kuril Islands, not from Kaliningrad and so on. They're places where you have to keep garrisons anyways. And they don't have much trained reserves, so combat veterans from Syria who had actually fought with the Russians and know the Russians, they've been kind of in Dar el-Zor and in Aleppo and Ghouta together. So if they kind of join the fight, well, that would help at least partially in the problem with reserves that right now the Russian military has.
Anthony, I saw you nodding to some of what Pavel was saying there, so I'm going to let you jump in, but I also wanted to ask you, what are some of the legal ramifications when it comes to foreign fighters volunteering for a conflict such as this one?
There's a big difference between foreign fighters who are kind of incorporated into the armed forces of one of the parties to the conflict, whether it's Ukraine or Russia. That is a perfectly established procedure with historical precedents, as Omar mentioned, the Spanish Civil War obviously being a primary one. And under the rules of war, it's perfectly accepted that you can bring people in. But the question is, are they part of the regular armed forces, or are they sort of freelancers who are kind of appearing on the battlefield really of their own volition without formally being incorporated into the armed forces? And that makes a certain difference, because if they are part of the armed forces, then they enjoy what's known as the privilege of the combatant. In other words, if they're captured, they haven't committed any crime, they have to be treated as prisoners of war. This is all assuming that they fight in a lawful way, but their presence on the battlefield is accepted. If they're just kind of freelancers or war tourists who are turning up with a gun, then they're in a different position, because they're still counted as civilians, but they're civilians who are fighting. And so potentially they could be prosecuted under the law of the opposing country for acts of violence.
Anthony, if I could just, sorry to interrupt, if I could just also ask you though, do you believe that there's going to be enough concern about what types of fighters are out there by governments that they would initiate releasing guidelines for their citizens to follow in the event that they want to volunteer in Ukraine?
It's been, looking at how Western governments have dealt with this issue has been interesting, and there have been some quite responses. So obviously the governments in Europe, the United States are very committed to supplying assistance to Ukraine, stopping short of joining the conflict themselves. And some of them, the British Foreign Secretary in particular, Liz Truss, went so far as to suggest that it would be a good thing for British citizens to go and fight. But the British Defense Secretary really kind of rode back on that comment. And I think he has the better case, because encouraging your citizens who may or may not have any military training to simply go abroad into a obviously very dangerous zone, there are a lot of risks to that. Obviously, the government can't protect them. The motivations why people may be there could be quite mixed. There are concerns, obviously, about some of them when they come back. So it's a complicated and delicate question, I think. People who have extensive military experience, who've served in armed forces, perhaps they would be able to make that adjustment. There's also a question about how these people would fight when they're there. Do they have the kind of discipline and training to fight in accordance with the laws of war? So there are a lot of concerns involved.
Omar, you were talking before about the different types of fighters, and you were talking specifically about mercenaries, and I'm curious to get your opinion about if governments are concerned about what may happen to some of these fighters once they actually return to their home countries.
There is usually that concern, but actually the mercenaries, when it comes to that concern, it's they're not the major concern because they're paid to fight. If you don't pay them, they won't fight, basically. But others, there may be some concerns with the volunteers, for example, that went in Syria and got particular type of training that could be used in urban terror, building of IEDs, sniping in urban areas, and so on and so forth. And they, because of the ideology, because of the worldview, the perception was that they may cause a threat when they demobilize and return back to their home countries, especially if they are affiliated with organizations such as ISIS and others. In the case of Ukraine, clearly it's a bit different. So the main, I guess, the main concern that the security services would not, Western security services would not come out and say this publicly because they need to be ideologically, politically correct and so on. But there's a concern with the ideology on one end, and there's a concern with the type of training that these volunteers will get. And of course, there's a concern for why did they go to the war and which organization they are affiliated with when they go to the conflict area. Some of this do not really exist in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian conflict, and initially did not exist in the Libyan conflict. Remember, there were several volunteers who went also to Libya to fight against Gaddafi regime back in the Libyan revolution in 2011, and there was limited. There was, let's say, less concern than when the case escalated in Syria in 2013 and 2014 and the rise of ISIS and so on and so forth. So these are some differences. But also I want to say that the foreign involvement, I agree with everything that was said, but I may differ a bit on the involvement of foreigners, because from the very beginning, from 2014, there were foreign fighters for very different reasons on both sides in the Ukrainian case, and the Bianca battalions, mainly from Moldovans, from Transnistria, some of the Serbian Hussar regiment, Serbian volunteers, that's fighting on the side of Russia, and some remnants of some battalions that fought for the Russians in Chechnya. The Vostok battalion is for one of them, although they somehow were incorporated loosely within the Luhansk and Donetsk and the backers back in 2014, but they showed up in Crimea. They were very clear in 2014. They were in Crimea and with videos and pictures. So they were there. These are ethnically Chechens.
Omar,